Hello everybody, thank you for coming. Thank you, Margaret, for accepting my invitation. Before starting the conference, I would like to thank all the people that have accepted my invitation and all the people that have made possible this conference. In particular, I would like to thank Mirella Capozzi and Lorenzo Magnani. Thank you for making me time.
Yes,
Lorenzo is coming this evening because he had a travel problem. And so I'm very happy to see you in the same room at last. Mentors, old friends, recent friend and you, I hope you know friends. I'm sure that our different skills and expertise and viewpoints will allow us to make meaningful progress and give us significant insight into the subject of the conference. I have to say that unfortunately Tom Nichols has had a big travel problem and he won't be joining us. But we are looking for a solution. I will keep you posted. Maybe a Skype conference, I don't know. Deciding what to do. But it's late, so it's time to start the workshop, and so I have to switch my role to substitute chairman, because the chairman was Tom. And so the first talk will be given by Margaret Morrison, and the title is Building Theories, Strategies, Not Blueprints. Margaret Morrison from the University of Toronto, as you can see. So thank you, Margaret.
well, thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. I've been to Italy several times as a tourist, but never to an academic meeting, so I'm very, very happy to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. So I'm going to sort of get right to it, as it were. The sort of question that's motivating the talk is really, in some ways, how do we think about the relationship between philosophical ideas about theory structure and the way that theories actually are built in science. And so I want to start off by looking a little bit at the philosophical background. That'll be familiar to everybody, so I'm going to go over that very quickly. And then look at what I hope are three different sort of strategies for theory building. Hopefully I'll have time. If I don't, I'm going to leave out number 3 and just skip to 4. And then wind up with some conclusions. But I'll sort of confess right now, I don't have an answer to that question, but I'm interested in hearing what people think. So I just want to try and present some strategies for theory construction, look at what those strategies tell us, how the strategies are used, and then go back and say, well, what is it that philosophical reconstructions of theories are telling us vis-a-vis these kinds of strategies that scientists are using? Okay, so what is a theory anyway? Well, there are philosophical accounts that everybody knows, the Semantic View, the Syntactic View, and these typically involve a reconstruction of theories that are used by scientists. So the working notion of a theory that scientists use are then taken and reconstructed or clarified by these various philosophical accounts, allegedly clarified. And again, I said the question is, how do these reconstructions actually help us to understand the nature of theories? Do they tell us anything interesting about how theories are used or how they function? So the syntactic view, of course, associated with logical empiricism, where a theory was an uninterpreted axiomatic calculus, usually expressed in first-order logic. We had correspondence rules that connected the laws with observable consequences, but there were lots of problems with that. First of all, specifying the meaning of the correspondence rules. How do you axiomatize theories in first-order logic? It wasn't immediately obvious that this was a realizable goal. Classical particle mechanics maybe is an example. Pat Suppi's tried to do this, but it's very difficult to reconstruct theories in this way. And then the problem of distinguishing the intended from the unintended models of the theory. How do you do that? So that then led to the semantic view, which was put forward by a number of different people, Pat Suppi, Van Frassen, Ron Geary, Fred Suppi, all of whom had slightly different configurations of the semantic view. Pat was interested in axiomatization. Van Frassen was interested in a sort of what he called the phase space, the state space approach. But the idea here was that theory was nothing but a family of models. And so you defined the intended models directly. You didn't have the problem that the syntactic view had of figuring out what the intended versus the unintended models were. And the semanticists often claimed that their use nicely overlapped with the view of a model that was prominent in logic. So the idea was that they could assimilate their view of model to the view of a model that was in Tarski. Now, I think this isn't entirely accurate because if you think about what Tarski was trying to do, Tarski's idea of a model was a realization of a theory where all the valid sentences were satisfied. So for the semantic view, you didn't have a theory, you just had a family of models. And you see some quotes from Suppi's and also Ron, Suppi's in particular, says the Tarskian sense of model can be used without distortion in both the mathematical and physical sciences. Meaning of the concept model is the same, the only difference in its use. But he also claims in his book in 2002 that the set theoretic use is the more fundamental one. Now, fundamental here meaning that if you're interested in logical reconstruction of theories, then you go to the set theoretic way of doing that. But for Tarski, the difference between a model and a theory is really what's paramount here. So there's really, in the semantic view, the theory is just the family of models, nothing else. So there's quite literally nothing for the models to be true of, because there's no separate theory. So it's kind of problematic to see how the sort of scientific view of models and modeling maps on to the Tarskian view, because the semanticists also claim that their notion of a model is the kind of model that scientists use. The other problem, I think, with the semantic view is how if a theory is just a family of models, then how do we differentiate all of the stuff that's in a model, all of the mathematical features that are often used in modeling for calculational purposes? How do we distinguish those kinds of things from what is the sort of core of the model, as it were? So when you're doing modeling in physics, you use things like perturbation theory. You have things like Hilbert space formulation of quantum mechanics that's based on functional analysis. That's very clearly a very different thing than talking about what the core elements of quantum mechanics are. The Schrödinger equation, the Pauli exclusion principle. So if the theory is just the family of models, how are you extracting the so-called core assumptions that tell you about what's going on in the physics versus all of the other mathematical paraphernalia? So if we look at the way the theories are actually constructed, there's usually some kind of clear identifiable core that we just simply don't get if we think about theories as being just this amorphous class of models. And I think that the development of theories, and what I'm going to try and argue today, or at least present, is that that process, the building of theories that we're here to discuss, isn't really a process of codification or of using some kind of blueprint for construction. Rather, it very often involves incorporating strategies that are going to be useful depending on the kind of phenomena that you're interested in, depending on the available methods that you have for treating that phenomena. And I think, just looking at the abstracts, I think this seems to be the way some other people are going as well with some of the talks. So what I want to do then is identify or look at 3 different strategies. There are a lot more, obviously. And in each case, I think you'll see that the process of building the theory or constructing the theory bears very little relationship to the reconstruction that's done in philosophical accounts. And so then you ask yourself, well, what should we conclude then from the philosophical accounts of reconstruction, of theory reconstruction? How valuable are they as sort of a posteriori accounts of what theories are like? Okay, so I'm going to start with a discussion of electrodynamics. A very sort of superficial discussion, but one that will enable you to kind of see the point or the sort of basic structure of how the theory developed. And it begins with a kind of bottom-up strategy from phenomena to theory via modeling. So it begins with that and ends with a top-down kind of approach. So the main idea behind the Maxwellian construction of electrodynamics is idea taken over from Faraday's experiments on magnets and electromagnetic phenomena. The idea is that the electromagnetic phenomena or electromagnetic effects are actually in the space that surrounds wires and magnets. They're not in the bodies themselves, they're in the space, and there's no forces acting at a distance. So you have 2 magnets, the attractive force between them is not something that acts at a distance, it's something that fills the space between the two bodies. So we've got a picture like this, and we've got the lines of force filling the space around the iron bar. So the problem is you need to be able to represent this idea of electromagnetic forces traveling in space. So how do you get a mechanical picture of that? So your Maxwell, everything has to be mechanical because it's just the mechanical time in history. Everything has to obey Newton's laws. So how is it that you can construct a mechanical representation of how these lines travel in space and indeed fill space? So Maxwell says, well, I construct a mechanical model and see if I can represent electromagnetic phenomena in that way. And so this is the model that he constructs, a pictorial representation. And we've all seen photographs of this or pictures of this in various places. It's a model of the ether, which at that time was seen as the carrier of light waves. So the idea is, well, if light waves are carried along by an ether, maybe electromagnetic waves can be as well. But how do we represent that? So this line here, AB, going through there, represents a current. The current sets up these little electrical particles, these little tiny balls there. They function like a bit like ball bearings. Maxwell called them idle wheels. They start spinning around. The spinning of these wheels causes these elastic vortices to move, and the movement of the elastic vortices then sets up a tension in the field, or in the ether. So you have the elastic vortices separated by these electrical particles, and when the action of the electrical particles on the vortices causes the vortices to deform. And that deformation, Maxwell says, involves a kind of displacement of electricity. So the electrical particles traveling along, scroll back, causes these larger hexagonal vortices to deform, and that deformation is what Maxwell identifies as a current. So the deformation of those large cells represents a current traveling through space. Now, the way that he's able to sort of conceive of a field theoretic account about this involves a reformulation or a corrections to Ampere's law. Ampere's law was originally a law about how electromagnetic forces traveled in closed circuits. But the problem was that all the circuits were closed in applications of Ampere's law. So there was no idea about forces, electromagnetic forces traveling across free space. So the question is, if you're going to get a field theoretic view, then you've got two phenomena here, and there's a field between them. So that's not a closed current. So you need to reformulate the law so it applies to open currents. So Maxwell's description of the model then is that it's a complete fiction. It's not something that is brought forward as an investigation in nature, but it's a mode of connection which is mechanically conceivable. So it's not even a hypothesis, it's just something that is conceivable, something that allows him to represent how possibly these electromagnetic waves might travel. So the question then is, how do you get from something that looks like this to this? It's not obvious, right? So what was the theoretical content in that model that allowed Maxwell to formulate the field equations? Well, again, the short answer is this modification of the Ampere circuit law. The modification of the law allowed him to then derive the electromagnetic wave equation that showed him that light and electromagnetic phenomena traveled at the same speed, and all of that happened via the introduction of something called the displacement current. So within this model then, in order for the electrical particles, for there to be a displacement of electricity here, for a current to flow rather, there had to be something called displacement of electricity, which Maxwell identified with a current. So you've got the two iron bars, and what we want to know is how these electromagnetic waves can travel in the space between the bars. So electromotive force then distorts the cells, the elasticity of the cells. That creates a state of what Maxwell calls polarization. But because these vortex cells are elastic, the polarization sets up a restoring force. And so that sets up a reverse current. So the polarization involves the elastic cells first distorting and then coming back. So they're doing this all the time as the current is flowing through. And this constant distortion and reversal involves what Maxwell calls a displacement of electricity in the field. And so charge builds up as a result of this constant distortion and reversal. And that so charge is built up through this tension in the medium, and we get an electromagnetic wave, an electromagnetic charge being set up in the medium or in the field. So we have this modification of Ampere's law, which originally, of course, would have a completely closed circuit here. It would just be a loop like this. But what Maxwell does is, we've got, remember, the two iron bars in the previous depiction. So how do we get the current flowing through here? Well, it's the result of this displacement term that is the consequence of the elasticity being distorted and then coming back, the reverse current. So he says, okay, we'll modify Ampere's law and make it applicable to open circuits, and it's this law of open circuits that allows to calculate the propagation of electromagnetic waves through space. So he calculates the velocity of the waves, finds out it's exactly the same as the velocity of light, says, well, we've got good reason to believe that light waves and electromagnetic waves are produced in the same way. But the problem is, of course, all of this is built up on the basis of that fictional model, right? And fictional model is no theoretical foundation. There's no experimental evidence for electromagnetic waves, so the theory is not really a theory at all. So what Maxwell does then is dispose of the model and formulate the theory using Lagrangian mechanics. So now we've gone from a bottom-up strategy, we've got the electromagnetic equations, field equations. Now he's going to derive them by kicking away the model from just using Lagrangian mechanics. So equations of motion then derived using virtual velocities and D'Alenberg's principle. What's the advantage of that? Well, the forces, the constrained forces related to the coordinates don't need to be interpreted literally in the way they do in Newtonian mechanics. So you don't need a theory of the mechanisms actually that are going on in the field, that the forces and the constrained forces that are causing the propagation of the waves, you can do away with all of that, and you can have a quantitative determination of the field using just the Lagrangian and energy and generalized coordinates. So, so what Maxwell does is that he just brings in this notion of displacement, formulates it as one of the basic equations, and simply defines it as the motion of electricity, or a quantity of charge crossing a designated area. But then, of course, we have no theoretical understanding of how it is that these waves are propagated. All of the equations are there. They fit the known phenomena, but there's no theory of how these waves can possibly be propagated independently of an ether model. So no specific account of the machinery. And Maxwell says we don't even attempt to define the forces governing the system because we can eliminate them from the equations of motion by the methods given by Lagrange. So what happens then is this theory of electromagnetism is developed, a very successful theory, without any real theoretical understanding of its foundations. So that's in part what led Hertz to say, well, Maxwell's theory is just Maxwell's equations, because there's not really, when we think about theories, we think about some kind of explanation about what's going on behind the phenomena, how the phenomena are produced, and here you have none of that. So you start with something bottom up to get the equations of motion for the electromagnetic field, but then you derive them by throwing away the model and not paying attention to any of the forces, because Maxwell doesn't know how they're produced. So a very successful theory, but with no real theoretical understanding, of course, until the electron is discovered. But 15 years later, confirmation of electromagnetic waves by Hertz, but still no real understanding of what's going on in the field, as I said, until the electron. Okay, so I haven't been keeping time. How far am I into my...
No, you have time.
Yeah, but how far am I into my 40 minutes?
22 minutes.
22, okay. Okay, so I'm going to then skip over and go to, I'll come back to that maybe. I'm going to now skip over and go to a rather different strategy, also in physics, and current sort of theory-building strategy that in high-energy physics that's concerned with asking questions about how we can extend the standard model to account for things that are currently not incorporated or not treated in the standard model. Things like dark matter and the hierarchy problem. So BSM physics, which is what is currently being done at CERN, so the Higgs particle's been found, and now the project at CERN is to extend the standard model, so BSM beyond the standard model physics, to deal with things like dark matter, the hierarchy problem. So what are the theories, the theoretical strategies that are being used there to try to develop the standard model, which is really a theory, beyond its current use? So the hierarchy problem is really the problem of why it is that the weak force, which governs, which is about electromagnetism and the electroweak theory, the weak force, is 10 to the 32 times stronger than gravity. So what happens is, a hierarchy problem is really about when a fundamental value of some physical parameter, like the mass of a particle, is vastly different from, in the theoretical context, the mass that's given in the Lagrangian, in the theoretical context, is vastly different from its measured mass, from its effective mass. That problem arises because very often the effective mass, the mass that's measured, is related to the pure mass through a process of renormalization, so that the effective mass gets corrected and corrections are added to the mass, so you get a kind of fine-tuning so that the effective mass will agree with the theoretical mass. And in the Higgs case, the Higgs particle is very much lighter than the Planck mass, which is the allowable mass for holding a single electric charge, elementary charge. So the question is then, why is the Higgs mass so light? And that's one of the components of the hierarchy problem. But the hierarchy problem has a sort of long-term, is a long-term problem because the Higgs mass can't currently be calculated in the standard model. But the idea is that some future revision of the standard model, the Higgs mass will be able to be calculated, but hopefully without fine-tuning. So you want the effective mass to be relatively close to the theoretical mass, and you don't want to have effective fine-tunings. In order not to have effective fine-tunings, that question about why the Higgs mass is so light has to be answered. So how is that answered? Well, the most common approach to this is something called supersymmetry, or minimal supersymmetric model. So supersymmetry postulates that there are superparticles that are partners of the particles that are currently in the standard model. But the problem is that there's been no evidence at all at the LHC of the existence of any of these superparticles or supersymmetry. So the only possible explanation, or one of the most popular explanation of this hierarchy problem, is supersymmetry. There's no evidence of it. So, what to do? A lot of the scenarios, also, a lot of the different models of supersymmetry or minimally supersymmetric standard models have a lot of assumptions that are based on unknown parameters. So, there's lots of the models give similar sorts of predictions. So lots of the attempts to recast the standard model in order to account for the hierarchy problem and in order to try to develop a supersymmetry model have very similar predictions, similar phenomenology, but they've got lots and lots of free parameters. So free parameters that you don't know the value for. They have to be put in by hand. So each signature of a particle that this model predicts could be produced in a variety of different ways. So you see a signal in the data, you've got one of these supersymmetry models or minimally supersymmetric models. You don't know what particles are responsible for producing the signature because there's so many free parameters. You don't know, if you don't know what particles are responsible, you don't know how those particles decay to produce the observed phenomena, and what particles are being produced, in fact, in the decay. So there's tons and tons and tons of unknowns here. So there's two main strategies that are have been developed in trying to extend the standard model and trying to move forward with solving the hierarchy problem. One is direct searches, production and detection of BSM particles. That's been, so far at CERN, a failure because there's been no evidence at all of either the particles or the supersymmetry. There was some stuff happened in December that people are still not sure what it indicates, but there hasn't been any kind of definitive account of this. The second is indirect searches. Now, what are indirect searches? Well, they're searches for fingerprints or indications of new physics using simplified models or model-independent searches. So here, you're trying to extend a theory with a model-independent search. So what does that mean? How could that possibly be something that's useful? What exactly are model-independent searches, and why would you use them to try to extend a theory? Well, the problem is that, as I said, there are a lot of scenarios that are possible, and no firm experimental evidence for any of them. So what the physicists are, what the experimentalists in particular, are trying to do is to take the data that came from the Higgs searches and other runs of the collider and try and recast that data. That is, so the data's been run for a particular purpose, to find the Higgs or for some other, and to then recast it and see what comes out when the data has been recast. So you reinterpret the data that's selected for supersymmetry or other kinds of searches, and you use a Monte Carlo simulation or some other kind of algorithm to recast that data into into a new search. And that's typically done on the basis of either a sort of simplified model or on the basis of recasting just the final state of the data. So you use different codes with a specific way of preparing the data, looking at particular kinds of masses, and you then adopt a very simplified model that could be promising for a particular scenario. And what you do is you look at how what that data is saying when it's recast, and then look at discrepancies between the data and the background effects and see whether or not there are any discrepancies, but without using any assumptions on the basis of new physics models. So you're just looking at data, recasting data in the hope that you'll see something, and then that something will then be the basis for trying to construct a new model. So the simplified models, so the other approach is to use just simplified models. The simplified models are ways of characterizing signals so that they're compatible with a lot of different sorts of models, not just one. So you start off just with a Lagrangian and a couple of particles with whose masses and couplings are known, and then you see how that model represents the data in a specific area. So the idea there is to reproduce, or to see if the model can reproduce the observed data. Then you compare that very simplified model to the full model of the system using some kind of simulation of both in a detector. And then you use that that simplified model just to study a very, very small region. So remember, the kind of energies that people are looking at CERN involve vast, vast regions, vast sectors. So the idea, if you've got so many free parameters, such large spaces, the idea is to now let's single down to very small parameter spaces and see whether there's anything that those small parameter spaces can tell us about the data that we may have missed in the larger search. So the small space can be studied really efficiently, but the problem is it's not as likely to produce something interesting. But if you've got the large space, you've got so many independent parameters, you don't know where to start. And there's been no experimental success, so people just throw up their hands. What do we do now? So these simple models then, they're not like full theoretical models. You've got just two particles interacting. They give you very simple results, but maybe they can be useful for trying to apply the mathematics to these very small constrained spaces. So And then you can presumably try and enlarge the parameter space until it explains all of the data that you have. So what these do is function as a kind of baseline model. So they function as a baseline model that describe the data, and then you can use these baseline models for then trying to build other models for extending the standard model. So their advantage is that they're independent of the full models with all of the physics in them. But that, of course, can be a problem and a benefit because they don't know how to discriminate, perhaps, between various extensions. So you have to constantly be testing these simplified models against the full models in simulation. And that, in fact, may be where their benefit comes from, just as a kind of piecemeal approach to extending the data, or extending the theory. So they don't necessarily provide a good global description of the data. But if you don't know how to extend the theory, then the idea is you have to start somewhere. So what they do is they identify the boundaries of search sensitivity. Where should people be looking for evidence of supersymmetry? Characterizing new signals where where we didn't see signals before because the data had been used for something different, and for deriving limits on more general models. So these models are interesting because they also can provide a sort of interplay between theory and experiment. So as I said, they provide the foundation for developing new theoretical models, but they also provide a foundation for informing experimental investigation. So they function in a kind of predictive and explanatory way. But because they have such a minimal structure, that predictive and explanatory function is very, very much constrained. It's important to point out here that they're not just simply data fitting. Very often when you think of very simple models like this, and like models of the nucleus or turbulence models, we have a set of data, we need to develop a model for it, so you're just fitting the data. These are something very different. They provide the basis for model extension, they inform experimental searches, but the problem is that because of their simplification, because of their simplified structure, you need to be able to take account of the way they may have systematic errors built into them, and that's not always easy. So that's why they need to constantly be compared with with other fuller models using simulation. So they've also so in these cases, then, the constraints on experiment, uncertainties about theoretical extensions of the standard model, lack of data for physics beyond the standard model, has resulted in a completely new approach to theory building at the LHC. There's no specific way to move forward. So if you ask the experimentalists, I think high energy physics is unique in that very often experiment and theory are closer together than they are perhaps in some other areas of physics, because the experimentalists are, in fact, in some ways theorists in their own right. There's a theoretical community there that's very interested in developing full models, but the experimentalists are very much theoreticians themselves. And the problem is that there's no specific way to move forward with theory building, no agreed upon way between the experimentalist and the theorist. The theorists are at a loss as to how to move forward with interesting new theoretical extensions to the standard model. So the sheer complexity of the project has resulted in a kind of all options are open strategy for theory building. And that's a very, very interesting phenomenon, I think, because this is where theory is really at the forefront now in physics, is at the LHC. And we find that both the theoreticians and the experimentalists are kind of at a loss as to how to go forward, because there's no data. You can't, very often these extensions of the standard model are so complicated that you can't really test them in the collider anyway, because the energies aren't high enough. And so theory and experiment are at a kind of impasse as to how to move on. And so what that's resulted in is a completely different way of building theories. That is just looking at what the possibilities are given the experimental constraints and given the theoretical options that are available. Okay, so I was going to talk also about Fisher and Fisher's sort of top-down strategy for mathematizing population biology, but I didn't have time for that, so I just skipped over that because it's just really a story about, again, employing mathematical methods where one couldn't bring together Darwinian theories of Darwinian selection developed by the biometricians and Mendel's laws into a coherent picture. So Fisher comes with a sort of new way of thinking about populations of genes, mathematical ways of treating selection and heredity, and comes up with a sort of mathematical synthesis of the two. But so just to sort of wrap up then, in the Maxwell case, what we saw was that the availability of the mathematical framework, the Lagrangian framework, was largely responsible for developing the theory of electrodynamics. It was the availability of this mathematical structure that allowed Maxwell to derive the field equations without attempting to describe how it is that the machinery behind the propagation of electromagnetic waves. And this was certainly true. That kind of top-down approach to building theories was certainly true also in the early days of high-energy physics, where a lot of theory construction was built around using symmetry principles and using these symmetry principles as constraints on what the theory needed to look like. The theory needed to obey certain kinds of symmetries, and so what follows from those symmetries vis-a-vis how we construct the physics of the theory. But now, as I said, with a lack of experimental evidence for supersymmetry and also for dark matter, we find a move away from those kinds of top-down analysis to a more bottom-up approach that's consistent with theory, but doesn't advance any kind of full-blown physical model. So there's the use of computer algorithms for recasting the data, and theory building is very much a response to, or a bunch of responsive strategies that take account of not just the phenomena that we're looking at, but also the goals, how those goals might be accomplished. And very often, as we saw, there's no real blueprint for that. It just happens in terms of what's available, how we can recast the data, how we can account for the data. And the philosophical reconstruction of theories doesn't really feed much, or doesn't really tell us much into how those insights are produced. It doesn't tell us much about how the theories are constructed. It's like a posteriori reconstruction of these theories once they're developed. But then the question becomes, well, what can we say as sort of philosophers of science about the development of theory construction that seems to be very, very different from what we've been saying about the theory of theories? So we've been talking about, as philosophers, the theory of theories, syntactic view, semantic view. That debate is still very much alive, very much going on between different groups of philosophers. But the larger question, I think, or the question that transcends the debates about the semantic versus the syntactic view is, what is it that those theories, what is it that those philosophical theories are telling us about the kinds of theories that scientists use? And I think that's an important question that we, as philosophers, really haven't looked at very carefully, at least in philosophy of physics. with respect to the way that certainly current theories, and indeed I think past theories as well, get reconstructed. So I kind of leave that as an open question, because I don't really know myself whether there are any benefits of these philosophical accounts, but I'd be interested to hear what you think on that score. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Margaret. We have about 20 minutes now. The session is open to discussion. So if there are questions, Giuseppe.
Well, thank you very much for your nice talk. I first would like to express a slight disagreement or different interpretation and then ask you a question. You mentioned about Maxwell that there was no real theoretical understanding. I don't think it's the right wording. There may be a situation close to quantum mechanics, namely, in that case, is even more so. The variety of formal approaches, like Heisenberg or Schrödinger, they happen to be proved even equivalent, which is very surprising, and yet there is no agreement about the interpretation. So the material interpretation is really what is open, and then there is a hidden variable approach, very different approaches based on philosophical assumptions about causality, essentially. Probably Maxwell, by a naive, very intuitive interpretation of phenomena, he gets to a very robust mathematical theory. So not so much a theoretical understanding about the ambiguities, the lack of interpretation, which will be provided elsewhere later in different ways. This was my remark. As for the question, when you said he used the Lagrangian, was he thinking in Hamiltonian terms like searching for geodetics? Was he using a variational method?
In the first account, he wasn't. In 1865, when he first started, you'd say he wrote 4 papers, or he wrote sort of 2 that were just sort of elaborating various ether models, and then the final one with the elastic ether model. Then when he got rid of the models in 1861-62, he wrote a paper, A Dynamical Interpretation of the Electromagnetic Field. And there he just used Lagrangian mechanics, but then in the treatise, he went to Hamiltonian.
So thinking in terms of geodetics.
Yes, yeah.
And variational.
Yeah. In the treatise in 1873, yeah. I guess what I was sort of trying to get at is that there's a kind of, here we've got this wonderful theory, and we've not only got no sort of real kind of interpretation in the way that we have with, even with quantum mechanics, there's lots of different interpretations, as it were, of the theory. But here, originally in the Maxwell case, we don't even know how these waves get propagated. How possibly could the wave travel through space? Because Maxwell does away with the ether model, and that was actually one of the big reason why Kelvin never accepted Maxwell's theory, because he just said there's no explanation of how these waves travel. How can I embrace the theory of electromagnetic waves when I know nothing about them? I can't have a mechanical model of them. So it was a real drawback to the theory in some ways. So it was a long time before that was actually explained properly.
Well, with entanglement in quantum
Yes,
mechanics,
yeah.
the same situation.
Same situation, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
We have a question from Michaela.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. That was a great talk. I guess I have a question about the model-independent searches and simplified models. So, I think that you were kind of looking at simplified modeling beyond standard model physics as a way of kind of reinforcing the strategy of, if I understood it correctly, the kind of bottom-up construction, because I think in the end you said this is a kind of move away from the old way of thinking about building theory, which is very much top-down, based on symmetry principles and so forth, which is true, I think, in some sense. And I guess the question I have for you, which is really very much an open question for myself, is about precisely the role of those simplified models. Because in a sense, those models are models of SUSY or the MSSM, so they're still kind of guided by those overarching theoretical framework that themselves have symmetry principles, have Fermion as a boson and so forth. But at the same time, we are trying to strip down all these complex assumptions that otherwise would make those models not applicable at the experimental level. So they seem to occupy genuinely the middle ground in between these kind of higher theoretical frameworks. They are still pretty much there, guided by theoretical and symmetry considerations. But then the challenge is, how do you translate that into something that applies at the level of data, the kind of data that they're looking for. So I don't know how much you see them as an example of a bottom-up strategy as opposed to, I guess, the models as mediators in this category, in between, genuinely in between the theory and the data.
Yeah, I think that the simplified models are, I guess when I was thinking of, sort of bottom-up, what I was thinking more of was, well, you just start with, a couple of, they have to be consistent with the larger models for sure, and they're constantly being tested against that. You start just with a couple of particles and some cross sections, and so, you're really starting almost at the level of data in some way, because, I see the model, the simplified models, as a kind of a slightly different scenario from the model-independent searches, where you're just using computer algorithms to recast the data. And then once the data are recast, then you think, okay, well, I can maybe use a simplified model to see how to actually interpret that data. So really, the model-independent searches are at the very bottom. So that's an interesting point, and I think probably you're right. I characterize it as bottom up because I'm thinking they're not developed starting from a sort of symmetry considerations at the top. But probably that's a more accurate way of thinking about the models as mediators. I try not too much to kind of recast everything in models as mediators. But I think that's probably a better way of understanding it. Thanks for that. I think that's probably right.
And Lindy?
Yes, first a comment and then a question. I'm very sympathetic to your last question about to what extent do the syntactic or semantic views of theories apply when we start talking about theories in science? Because I really wrestled with that in my earlier work and in my book about strategies for Mendelian genetics. Because I had a beautiful statement by Thomas Hunt Morgan of the theory of the gene in a paragraph, and you almost never get that from a scientist. My theory is this. And I was looking at the development of it from 1900 to the 1930s, and I was saying, how am I going to characterize this as a theory? Because there are laws there. It is called a theory. It fit better with the philosophical accounts than the work I'm doing later that I'll talk about tomorrow. And so, but the syntactic stuff, who wanted to axiomatize Mendel's laws? A few people, but I didn't. And how did I characterize the theory? And Fred Seppi was my colleague at the time I was working on that. And he had this whole view about models, but what I was finding is something I called anomaly-driven theory redesign. That was one of the strategies I was looking at because, when they found linkage, that was what made them actually have to make two laws. There was only one law to begin with. So there were all of the way anomalies drove the changes was a very important part of the story I was able to tell and the kind of one of the strategies I was able to work with. But Fred's view of models, and he was working with big data sets from NASA, was the model is an idealized thing. And it's sort of like Hardy-Weinberg's. I'm sorry I didn't talk about the population genetics case because this would coincide with that. So if you're doing this top-down mathematics view, from his point of view, if you have an idealized model, it's sort of what happens if nothing is disturbing it. And an anomaly in the data for NASA said, something interesting astronomically. But for me, what you expect is, 9:3:1 ratios, and an anomaly tells you something is, it has to be changed in the theory. And so you can't say that that's the model. The model, so I don't know, it's just, I didn't find that these ways of talking philosophically fit that case very well at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I struggled with, what do I, from this biological point of view, analyze as a theory, as a philosopher?
Yeah.
And I just kind of talked it. Because what I was really interested in were the strategies for theory change, and I have lots of those. And I didn't get them by doing a philosophical reconstruction. I tried to do them by looking at historically actually what the changes were, but then standing back and hypothesizing strategies. So I just kind of had to step back from my colleagues' way of analyzing theories.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the population genetics case is interesting because you think, well, is there even a theory there? I mean, what could the theory be? Well, is it just gene frequencies? Maybe it's just gene frequencies and Hardy-Weinberg.
Well, see, Hardy-Weinberg is a really interesting case of this because it's an idealized mathematics. It's what's happening if nothing is happening.
Yeah.
And then if there's selection, it distorts it.
Yeah.
So it really is really quite different.
Yeah.
And philosophers of physics always love population genetics because it's one of the few areas in biology where the math tells you anything.
Yeah.
And he's totally wrong. He's
Yeah.
totally wrong.
It's way oversimplified.
Totally wrong. The fixed observer, absolutely arbitrary one, if you discuss with an evolutionist, immediately gives counterexample, elephants, hyenas, I can tell
Well,
you
see,
about
the
this.
anomalies are what tell
Yeah. So it starts to look, I mean, theoretical populations, it starts to look like the semantic view in some ways, families of models. But I think if you go back to Fisher and the way that that he sort of constructed that theory in the early 20s, then it doesn't really look like the semantic view at all. I mean, I think it's development now. It's just, you know, sort of lots of models and lots of, you know, sort of mathematical approaches for characterizing things. Looks a bit like the semantic view, but doesn't give us any insight into what was going on with Fisher's development of it.
Donna? Yes, can I also make a comment on your open question?
Yeah, that was why I raised it.
Well, I was going to comment that this is rather related to some local Rome philosophy which is going on, which not everyone here may know about, I don't know. Because Carlo has put forward the view for mathematics, not for physics, that mathematical logic is basically useless. It doesn't tell you anything about mathematics. What we should do is try and develop a logic of discovery for mathematics, which is not at all like traditional mathematical logic. Now, this would also, you could answer your open question by extending this to natural sciences, because the similar view would be that, well, actually, mathematical logic doesn't work.
Yeah.
So all this analysis of theories which they're doing is not helpful. And what we should do instead, which it seems to me what we're actually doing, is try and develop a kind of logic of scientific discovery, which is not at all based on mathematical logic. So I'm just putting forward this as a kind of rogue input here. I mean, I am in London, but I come to Rome quite often, so I know what's going on. So, does that sound sympathetic?
That sounds very sympathetic, yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I think that, I mean, the problem with the semantic view of, well, is most people, I think, today are more sympathetic to the semantic view than the syntactic view. But the semanticists seem to want to have it all. I mean, I think this is the problem. They want their model theoretic account to be to capture scientific practice, but yet they say that they're also using the logician sense of model in the Tarski sense, which is clearly not the case. You know, you're doing one thing or the other, but they're not doing both. And so I think Van Frassen's phase space approach is the closest that you're going to get to the scientific view. And certainly Van Frassen never claims that he's using these models in the Tarski sense. So the project in the Tarskian project, I think, is something that can't really be mapped on in any kind of accurate way to what's going on in philosophical modeling. So I suppose that, in scientific modeling, so I think that, yes, I agree with you. I don't know that you can, but I don't know that you can develop a logic of discovery, because there's just, the field is too wide open. I mean, as soon as you start to try to codify these sorts of things and classify them in some particular way, you're going to get, you know, a new strategy over here. I mean, high energy physics had a very well-defined strategy up until a few years ago. And now the field is just wide open because of the problems and the nature of experimental evidence. So I think even within disciplines, the whole idea of a logic of discovery is very, very fluid. It depends on what's happening in the discipline.
Are there other questions?
May one.
Okay,
I'm
two
a
questions.
physicist, but not
Yeah,
a philosopher of physics. But again, this is a genuine question. It is about your final doubt. And it is a doubt about the possibility of a theoretical understanding of what is going on at the experimental level, given that, as you said, experimental scientists seem to proceed, if they use models, with local versus global models. Is this your doubt about a possible explanation, theoretical explanation, or is about the possibility of heuristic strategies? I mean, of having an idea that a heuristic or a logic of discovery, whatever you want to call it, is possible at all. Yes, these are related but different questions.
Yeah.
But at the end, there is a positive side to what you said. Anyway, if there is a third doubt, are philosophers any good at working with these kind of things? Well, if they are capable of asking these questions, of giving to a working scientist at a theoretical level or at experimental level some uneasiness about what they are doing, I think this is a good philosophical practice.
Yes, no, I completely agree. I think philosophers have a role to play here by sort of not imposing a sort of philosophical theory on the practice, but rather looking at, because the practice itself, and indeed the theories themselves, generate their own philosophical problems and issues.
Yes.
And so I think what philosophers can bring to that is, you know, the sort of analytical tools that we are trained to use. And to just look at what assumptions are being made, how the practice relates to particular goals. And so I think there's lots of room for philosophical discussion and philosophical analysis. It's just that it doesn't come from some attempt to codify a theory and of theories and then say, well, this is what the theory has to look like because this is the, you know, the nice, clean philosophical reconstruction. So yeah, I completely agree that there's a lot of philosophical input that's, I think, valuable in this context. The other thing that you said is about heuristics. I think that there are, that heuristics are very important, but what I'm skeptical about, I suppose, is the idea that I think that heuristics come and evolve with the practice and the theory. And so, for example, you know, 15 years ago in physics, if somebody had said that, you know, a lot of the physics that was going on, high energy physics that was going on now was going to involve these kinds of simplified models and model-independent searches. I think it would probably maybe be rather surprising. But it's a response to certain problems that require new strategies. So those strategies develop in conjunction with the problems as they arise. And that's not to say that there isn't interesting philosophical work there either. But it's not of the sort that we have traditionally thought of when we are thinking about theory analysis or, theory, what is a scientific theory?
Yeah.
A question from Marta.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. Actually, you have just answered my question about the heuristics, right, of theories. So, yeah, thank you very much for this. May I have another quick, short question, which is maybe a framework question, right, about the big. I'm working on biological theories and models more than physics, and so I'm wondering if you think that moving from the physics field to the biological field, there is some insight we can get from an explanatory framework instead of a logical reconstruction of theories and relationships among theories. In the biological field, usually there is an interesting discussion going on precisely on the explanatory import of theories, right? And on the relationships among different theories when we have to account for functional dynamics.
Yeah.
At that level, sometimes a perspective from logic and from a logical reconstruction of theories instead of an explanatory perspective on what is going on in the real science is not so relevant actually. So I'm wondering if you can see something like this in the development of theories that you are looking at in physics.
Yeah, I think the same thing happens. I mean, it sort of, a lot of things that, in physics very often it's the sort of the construction process is very often about how the mathematics gets used. Right. And so in high energy physics, it's very often about the development of the theories in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Were all were related to symmetry constraints. Right. And so the idea is that, well, the theory has this symmetry structure, and so we need to preserve the structure that applies to certain kinds of phenomena. So electromagnetism obeys the U1 symmetry group, weak force is the SU2, then quantum chromodynamics is SU3, and so if you unify the theory, you want to put all those together in some kind of big patchwork symmetry group, because a unified theory is going to have a unified symmetry structure, but that's not really a unified symmetry structure, right. Hence all the free parameters you get when you try to... so it's a kind of... It's not even so much a sort of, it's not really a logical analysis, it's an analysis that's motivated, I think, from the way the mathematics is used. And very often the dynamics comes out of the mathematics. The mathematics that sort of dictates the dynamics. And that sounds funny.
Well,
but it's
it's an interesting point, I think, right now in science, right? Because
and then
thank you very much.
And then the other thing, I'll just say one more thing. The other question then becomes, well, what actually are these symmetries? I mean, are they they function as part of the theory, but really they're mathematical objects, or they're abstract in some way. So what's the sort of, what symmetries are real and what symmetries aren't real, and that's a debate that's going on in philosophy of physics, like local gauge symmetry is real, well, no, are global phase symmetries real, well, yes. And so there's a lot of debate about that. So
it's the same in biology with networks. And that kind of concepts, right? Thank you very much.
Are there any questions?
Could I just ask for a summary
Yeah.
of the strategies that you talked about? There were 3, but I kept getting mixed up.
Yeah.
So there was top-down and bottom-up, is that right?
So the bottom-up strategy was Maxwell's original work on using the ether model. So he's got this idea that, based on Faraday's work, that these lines of, that the electromagnetic phenomena involve lines of force in space. So how is it that we can think about lines of force in space? And so he constructs his model, possibility structure, for doing that, and then working from that up, he's able to then develop these field equations based on the mechanical structure of the model. So, telling a story about how electromagnetic waves are produced in that model allows him to derive these field equations. It's a long sort of process, but that's the end structure. So then he's got these equations, but he's got this this horrible model that couldn't possibly be real, couldn't possibly represent the real structure of the ether or the field. So he gets rid of it and then does a kind of top-down derivation of the field equations from Lagrangian mechanics.
Often when people use the word bottom-up, they mean going from data and finding patterns of data, but you're using bottom-up in a different sense
Well,
here,
in
of going
some way,
from a hypothetical possible model.
but in some ways it's data, because the data come from experimental work that Faraday did. And so the ideas that Faraday had based on these the experimental research that he did, Maxwell then tried to develop into some kind of theory. So it really did start from data.
Okay, so I was just trying to extract from your case. I know it's always hard for me too to put my case aside, but it's bottom up, top down, and then the last one was the complexity with.
The last one is
hypothetical
all
model.
over the place.
Bottom
Yeah,
up, top down.
But
no,
it's more bottom up than it is top down. It's in contrast to previous ways that theories in high energy physics were developed.
I sort of came here with the idea, maybe we can all have some set of heuristics, set of strategies that, a list anyway, when we're done. So I was just pushing you on that. I actually tried to make a slide of my own just for this group, trying to do that. So we'll see whether that works or not.
Questions? We have time for a final questions? Final question? Maybe I have one question for you.
Okay.
So, thank you, Margaret, for your nice talk. And I was interested in your, when we're talking about the interconnection between the experimental level and the theoretical level. And maybe you can move from physics to another subject that maybe you are interested in, stock markets.
Yeah.
And in that case, maybe the interconnection is so difficult to untangle that maybe you cannot even say if a data is the product of model of a theory. And so,
Yeah, that's right.
and in that case, maybe we need a set of very different strategies into reconstruction.
Well, I think what's going on really is people are looking for patterns in the data. So how do you take all of this sort of data that gets stored from computer trades and, millions and millions and millions of pieces of data, and you apply certain sorts of techniques to look for patterns, and try to then see what those patterns, if anything, are telling you about the fluctuations in financial markets.
Yeah.
But I think, and then that whole project of econophysics is trying to do that. But again, there you've got all sorts of different interpretations of what's going on. There's agent-based models, then there are models of agents where the agents look just like molecules in statistical mechanics. They make assumptions about zero intelligence, random motion, all of these, with quite literally, the financial market looks like a gas.
Yeah.
And so then what comes out of that? And depending on how the market is characterized, then using all of these assumptions that are clearly not true, how should you think about the output of those models, what they're actually telling you with anything. So maybe it's just patterns in the data and nothing else.
Yeah,
Yeah,
maybe,
yeah,
yes.
yeah. But yeah, I don't even think that if there's any theory there, it's a theory that's borrowed from other fields in an attempt to try to use modeling assumptions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
We have now 20 minutes of break for coffee. We don't have this,
Ma poi quanto fanno?
1 hour and 5 minutes, 10 minutes. You have time.
We are running quickly, right?
We are in room.
Thank you.